The following program from Gilbert Highet's Literature and Great Writers series is brought to you by Jeffrey Norton Publishers. All rights are reserved.
You should build your own library, as though you were building something which would last all your life, and perhaps longer. Not the bookshelves and such external things, no, the books themselves, chosen and read and placed with understanding and affection. Everyone except illiterates and quasi-illiterates has a little library of his or her own, even if it's only a few novels picked up haphazard or a shabby collection of paperbacks. Everyone starts with some books, a Bible, a do-it-yourself manual, a mystery story. The standard of education throughout the United States is more or less paced by the sales of books in various regions. The stupider any area is, the fewer good schools it has, the fewer books its inhabitants buy and borrow from libraries. Books are not all of civilization, but they are one of the essential carriers of civilization. Since we are nearly all building our own libraries, here are a few hints which might be useful. Hints from an old lover of books who acquired his first volume 48 years ago, bought his first volume 45 years ago, and bound his first volume with his own hands 40 years ago. I still have it too, although the glue is beginning to dry up and the sewing to come apart. Naturally, we start with the few indispensable books for consultation, not for reading, the books of reference, without which we can scarcely have an intelligent discussion or read an intelligent book, the dictionary, the encyclopedia, and all the other settlers of arguments. You know, every week, sometimes every day, people take the trouble to telephone me or write me at Columbia University in order to ask me some perfectly simple question which they themselves could have solved within 5 minutes if they had had 2 or 3 simple, cheap, and widely distributed reference books at their hand. Ridiculous, isn't it? Beyond those, we all have our individual look-it-up shelves, depending on our personal interests and hobbies. Everyone ought to have a first aid book. Most people need cookery books. Anyone who spends any time in the country needs a garden book and a bird book and a tree book. There are books on the maintenance of automobiles, on income tax, on childcare. Just make sure that you buy reasonable books and not the works of crackpots. I still remember a period of considerable unhappiness when my wife and I were misdirected by a book about how to raise small babies, and we all three suffered a great deal. It's a grave responsibility to write a book. But now for real reading. We begin with the central books, which are part of almost every educated person's mind, which are thought about and referred to, consciously or unconsciously, every day, the Bible and Shakespeare. From these we go on to the more or less permanent works of fiction which have been created during the last century or so. Tolstoy's War and Peace and Anna Karenina, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, and probably the Brothers Karamazov, Melville's Moby Dick, a few of the best of Mark Twain and Charles Dickens, the perverted pageant of Proust, some of Thomas Mann, Faulkner's central works. Add to these the novels which have most powerfully impressed you and seem to you unforgettable. Now you have part of the core of a library. You need poetry also, and good non-fiction. In buying poetry to keep, follow your own taste. If your taste is still developing, then buy several good anthologies of poetry, ancient and modern, original and translated. Keep them, read them off and on for a year or two, and then your taste will form itself. You will know whether you prefer Robinson Jeffers or Robert Frost, Browning or Cummings. Personally, I may say I buy every anthology of poetry which looks intelligent and varied and rich. Even if I find only a dozen good poems in it which I didn't possess, they are my reward. As for permanent non-fiction, I think that depends entirely on your habit of mind, although I do believe that Toynbee's study of history is likely to last at least another generation and ought to be first on that particular shelf. If you are inclined to philosophy or to religion, to science or to economics or to history, there are many good books which promise to last. But then you should have a couple of shelves devoted purely to fun, ease, relaxation, pleasure, something to pick up in odd moments when you cannot face the logic of life or the effort of thought, something to read while you're in bed with a mild virus infection, something for a peaceful evening when you cannot stand any more guffawing audiences and shouted commercials. Yes, shouted commercials! Something easy. Similar books should be put in every guest room. Not whither are we drifting books, nor books about our role in Tristan da Cunha, but books which produce the same effect as a chicken sandwich and a glass of champagne. The works of James Thurber, some fantasy fiction, some intelligent whodunits, light books of travel, some well-written ghost stories, books which you need not read, but go on reading for pure diversion. Now, this is becoming a personal library. As you read books and buy them, you will find that your own tastes come out more and more strongly. There are special hobbies which interest you. There are problems still unsolved on which good books are written. Neglected aspects of human activity deserve more attention. You have been to some strange and charming place and wish to explore its past and its present. For all these reasons, you will buy books. A man who was captivated by a lecture on, say, astronomy, which he heard at school, may well recall it 20 years later and begin to read more about modern astronomy. Or else he may pass on to the new topic of space travel, or to the important and still misunderstood subject of weather and climate. The brilliant young fellow who deciphered one of the ancient Greek scripts called Minoan wasn't a professional scholar at all. He was an architect, I think, by profession, but he recalled that he had heard, while he was still a schoolboy, a lecture on the problem of these scripts by Sir Arthur Evans, who had dug up many of the clay tablets on which they are written. The problem fermented in his mind for years. He devoted his brain to it as soon as he had some leisure. He collected books and articles about it, and, with the brilliance of an amateur, which, I may say, sometimes brings tears to the eyes of the professionals, with the brilliance of an amateur, he solved it. A man who recognizes reluctantly that his temperament will never allow him to be a good chess player will still collect books on the history of the game, biographies of its masters, analyses of its more peculiar problems. Another, again, who has spent some time in the western United States, may buy books on the history and character of the American Indian, and will find in them enough to feed his imagination for a long time. Others will gather books on mathematics, its puzzles and personalities, extrasensory perception, business cycles, psychoanalysis, the ballet, local and family history, and even, I'm glad to say, nonsense. Your library will now go on growing almost by itself, but it needs a little care. It is not an external thing like a doormat. It's more personal than a car. Like your furniture and pictures and ornaments, it is a reflection of your feelings and your mind. No more than you would have a cracked piece of linoleum under your dining room table should you have a collection of dirty, dog-eared, crippled books on your shelves. No more than you would have your phonograph blaring out a random selection, mixing Tibaldi with Spike Hughes and old Carusos with new Presleys, should you have shelves in which Mickey Spillane leans against Edith Sitwell. Books need a little arranging and a little maintenance. To make sure that they will remain with you, it's a good idea to have your own book plate pasted inside the front cover. There are many pleasant book plates which can be adapted for individual use, on sale in stationers' shops, or you can persuade an artist friend to design one specially for you. Or, if you're a photographer, you can make your own. I remember back in 1929, when I had just a few books which I treasured, a friend of mine who was an artist designed a book plate for me. Those were the days of sharp, angular, modernist designs, and this book plate was highly unfashionable. It was calm and balanced and reposeful and harmonious, a head and a landscape out of the pictorial tradition of the early Italian Renaissance. But I liked it. I saved up some money and had a plate made of it, and I've used it ever since. Jimmy Wardrop, who drew it for me, he's dead now, but his friendship and his sensitive taste remain alive for me whenever I open one of my books. There's also an almost indispensable addition to your library, which is not a book at all, but a collection of book material. This is a box file, or a large decorative envelope, or anything more or less permanent and not too disagreeable to look at, into which you can put newspaper clippings, magazine articles, interviews, programs of concerts, and catalogues of art exhibitions, and so forth. It's surprising how many things of that kind turn out to be worth keeping. You will often reread an article from your own file when you wouldn't think of handling the back numbers of the magazine in which it first appeared. One further hint, which is sometimes forgotten: public libraries are fine things, and we all ought to use them, but they do not replace a personal library. When you see a book which really attracts you, buy it. Take it out of the library first, if you like, and read it to see whether you are sure. But if you are sure, then buy it. In part, this is a kindness to the author, who has to live and pay his taxes and his mortgage. One of the surest ways to wound any writer, however insignificant, is to write telling him that you loved his book, even although you had to wait 6 months before your name came up on the waiting list at the lending library. In part, it's insurance. Books are apt to go out of print when their authors die. They disappear even before that and cannot be discovered except with inordinate effort. There's a story about a southern farmer who was sitting on his porch, Whitland, when his wife screamed at him. "Joe," she cried, "Joe, an alligator just ate one of our children." He thought for a while, then he said, "You know, Polly, I thought something been getting our children." Well, even if an author births a good book and nourishes it and teaches it to stand by itself, some alligator is apt to get it. And you and I ought to make sure that it has some chance of survival by buying it and putting it on our shelves. Remember also that there are many guides to help you in building a good personal library. To begin with, there are some very competent, level-headed and candid book critics in the United States. If you pick 2 or 3 of them and read their reviews fairly regularly, you will recognize their strengths and their weaknesses and learn, within limits, to trust their taste. Again, at the end of every calendar year, the best magazines and newspapers usually list the 100 books produced during that year which have most chance of surviving with distinction. From these lists, you could easily assemble 2 or 3 highly interesting shelves. Then there are a number of exceedingly useful books about books, which classify and describe hundreds, even thousands, of important works in all fields. The best is probably Hester Hoffman's Bookman's Manual. There's a fine paperback called simply Good Reading, which would keep most people going for a lifetime. And I often recommend a book list made up for Trinity College, Hartford, by Professor Harry Todd Costello, called Books for a College Student's Reading. When in doubt, always ask a librarian. Trained librarians always have lists ready at hand. Some even make up and distribute their own. They're always willing to help, for they love books. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this has been of some assistance to you. I've been talking about forming a personal library as though it were a pleasure and a weight of pleasure, and indeed so it is. But it is also something of a duty. It is the mind that makes us truly human. If the mind is never fed on anything more than television stunt programs and old movies and short reports in the newspapers and casual conversations, it will never operate at more than half its capacity. It will start to atrophy, like an arm with a withered muscle. A house without books usually means a mind without either knowledge or thought or enjoyment of its own powers.